Ti. That's more realistic anyway. And if you set the frame rate limit to 120, you'll definitely be fine, even on a 9700K. As for AMD, we had to invest a lot more effort into getting this to bug out because AMD isn't natively fast enough to trigger the issue. Here's a chart with the 3700X. Stock, the 3700X was doing 131 FPS average and 78 FPS 0.1% lows, which are both fine numbers. In order to push closer to the stutter threshold, we tried higher frequency memory, we tried tuning Infinity Fabric in memory to 1 and we tried running at 4.3 gigahertz all core. But we had issues where the CPU would not always reproduce the original performance. This might be related to patches in between, so we'll ignore the original number and work with the new data instead. The only times we were able to trigger hard stuttering on the 3700X were when we had it clocked to 4.85 gigahertz or 4.80 gigahertz with 3800 megahertz RAM and 1-to-1-to-1 clocks. Also overclocking the GPU, which finally caused it to stutter down to 21 FPS 0.1% lows. As a quick aside, we couldn't go higher than 5 gigahertz or even 4.9 with the 3700X because in order to do that, we need more cold, and to bring the temperature down below 100 degrees, we have to drop Infinity Fabric to 1467 megahertz, which makes performance worse. So we stayed below 5 gigahertz, that way we could keep the Infinity Fabric set to a higher value. Anyway, the 21 FPS 0.1% low number we have here was enough for accomplishing our goal, which was to investigate whether this issue can occur on both AMD and Intel and whether it's vendor agnostic. And it is vendor agnostic, but it's extremely difficult to reproduce on AMD. AMD is not immune, it's just that AMD has a raw speed deficit and so is able to escape by the issue. Some of this may be GPU driver overhead related as well, which is why overclocking the GPU would have helped with the AMD CPU. We also saw stutters at 4.8 gigahertz though, where 0.1% lows were 30 FPS. Note that all of these for the 3700X were 8-core 8-thread. Doing 4-core 8-thread would not provide sufficient performance to even begin to reach the FPS threshold. And then also remember that average isn't a maximum, so a lower 0.1% low value with frame time spikes north of 100 milliseconds, for example, will also drag down the average number below where the threshold is, so it doesn't look like it's hitting, even though it might be. So then closing out this part of the video, this confirms that no, hyperthreading is not the reason for the performance here, and the lack thereof is not. The game doesn't know the difference. All it knows is that it wants, in this instance, it appears to be at least more than 8 threads to work optimally with a high frame rate, as illustrated by the 9700 and 9900K. So there is an optimization here. Rockstar does have a problem that we'd like to see them solve in the future. That said, it's also a problem that is sort of resolvable, in air quotes there, because you can work around it by bringing down your top-end performance to, say, 120 FPS max. And realistically, most people who are running something like a 9700K and a GPU sufficiently fast to even allow triggering of this issue will probably be running at least high settings anyway, which would bring you down below that FPS threshold, so you would be fine. It's a very specific user who will encounter this, one who has maybe a 9700K and also wants 140 FPS, in which case you're out of luck. It's an optimization issue then. People like to say that games are poorly optimized. All the time you see it. It's always one of the top comments on a new benchmark. This game is poorly optimized for PC. No one knows what they're talking about when they say that. If you asked most of those commenters, what is unoptimized about it? Can you point to what can improve? They wouldn't know. Not at a code level, not even at an abstract level. Most of the time, people just have no idea. Now, sometimes you can point to something like textures and have a good idea there. But for the most part, it's hard to identify. This is something that's pretty easily identifiable as a specific issue that Rockstar should fix at some point, because it's existed for 4 or 5 years now. So Rockstar, you have absolutely no excuse for continuing to let this issue exist in the rage in the engine, the Rockstar Games engine. Threads in a game engine are typically assigned to things like you might have one thread for rendering. That's pretty common for all the draw calls, things like that. That's typically your most heavily loaded thread. You'll probably have another one for physics. You might have another one for AI. You'll probably have one for audio processing. Game logic might be in there with AI, stuff like that. And however Rage is set up, it's set up in a way that again, it has to be a sufficiently high frequency, high FPS, which is what makes it so weird. At a sufficiently high FPS, something catches. Maybe it's tripping over the render thread, where now stutters are introduced and there's not enough load sharing between the threads, so the slowest one is going to start choking performance. That's our theory for it anyway, but this should be resolved. Probably talked about this one enough for now. I'll note that we did try enabling triple buffering and it didn't work here. And we tried lowering the in-game refresh rate without setting VSync and that didn't work, but you saw our earlier results for that stuff if you want to set it up. Let's get into the asynchronous compute topic. The next theory has been largely a community propagated one that async compute in the XML file helps improve frame time stability. We've had a lot of trouble validating this claim, but it did lead us to discover some general consistency issues with the game. Asynchronous compute must be leveraged both at a code level and a hardware level, and the XML settings file located in Documents, Rockstar Games, and Red Dead 2's settings folder contains a flag for async compute that's set to false by default. Now, there's probably a reason it's set to false by default, like maybe not working or not working properly. We're not quite sure what it is, but our first set of tests was on Turing with the 2080 Ti. Tested at 4K, our results were almost perfectly accurate between both async on and async off configurations. By perfectly accurate, what we really mean is they were basically identical and each run was more or less identical to the previous run, which is great. Consistency is good in benchmarking. We ran 64 FPS average, 39 to 40 FPS average for the 1% lows, and 38 FPS for the 0.1% lows on average between the results. The original bench from launch day was a little higher across the board on average, but also tested before numerous patches. These 3 data points are averaged of about 15 total runs, and therefore tens of thousands of frame time data points. So we're confident in the repetition and the consistency of the results. The standard deviation for the async on and async off tests with this particular configuration both run on the same day, 0.3 FPS standard deviation for 1% lows and 0.7 FPS standard deviation for 0.1% lows. We were unable to validate user remarks that the async flag did anything on the 2080 Ti, at least at this resolution. We next tested with a 2070 Super at 1440p. For this one, we were again happy to see the consistency of our test passes thus far. For these two, our standard deviation is roughly the same as the 2080 Ti, and our data lines up almost precisely between async on and async off. There was no difference for a 2070 Super at 1440p with high settings and some custom settings mixed in. Just to be sure that we weren't hitting some resolution constraint before anything else became relevant, we also dropped down to 1080p medium with the 2070 Super. For this set of tests, we again saw the same results between each benchmark. We have thus far been unable to produce differences on these two RTX cards. On to the more difficult one now. The RX 5700 XT was a very mixed bag. We spent an entire day and a bit more running and rerunning tests on 2 different 5700 XTs just in case. However, we also learned that the benchmark results are less consistent. There doesn't seem to be a pattern to it. Some games, the first pass will score notably lower or higher than others, so we do add passes to account for that when it happens. But in this game, it'll seemingly randomly score higher or lower for frame time pacing. Doesn't matter what order it's in, or how many passes you run, or how many times you restart. This indicates mixed overall frame time consistency. It did not surface in our initial benchmarks because we had higher scoring on average, as you saw in that initial benchmark video, but after dozens of additional tests, we've now narrowed it down so that you can see frame time pacing can be more variable than originally seen. So here's a sample list of a few of the tests that we ran most recently without charting. This should help show some of the raw data for what we're dealing with. This isn't all the data, but it's enough to show you what's going on. For asynchronous compute support disabled, we measured 0.1% low values between a completely acceptable 68 FPS average and for 0.1% lows, and a poorly paced 35 to 36 FPS. This was one set of passes, but we ran another after this and saw much the same placement. We can't definitively draw any conclusions from this, aside from the fact that the averages are largely unaffected by occasional one-off frame time hitches in the middle of testing that can last for anywhere from 5 to 15 frames. The Tai Chi had the same inconsistent performance, albeit different absolute values. We didn't run the Tai Chi as much. It was really just there to make sure there weren't any crazy issues with the other card that we didn't know about, and there were not. This is presumably what async enablement is supposed to fix, but it doesn't. We had identical results with asynchronous compute support enabled in the XML file. When things went without a literal hitch, we measured 64 FPS 0.1% lows, and it hit 36 to 38 when the one-off spikes dragged down the averaging across anywhere from, again, maybe 5, 7 to 15 frames. Asynchronous compute enabled and disabled changed nothing here. We don't have any conclusion we can draw from this, other than to say the XT seems to be scoring less consistently in our test platform. We validated this on 2 separate identical GPU test benches, and so we'll have to revisit this after some additional testing, maybe after more patches to figure out what to do next. To better illustrate this variability, we can rely on some frame time plots. This first plot shows the Gigabyte 5700 XT at 1080p, and with one of the higher results and one of the lower results. No settings were changed between these. The game was fully restarted between each of these 2 tests. In this set of data, you can see that they're actually pretty close to identical all the way through the test, with one exception around the 3000 frame mark. In this instance, we have sustained spikes up to just above 28 milliseconds, or at 28 milliseconds, which drags down the average frame time significantly. The spike in this specific example sustains for approximately 7 frames, meaning we've gone from about 11 millisecond frame times to nearly 30 for 1/5 of a second. That's definitely noticeable. It's not the worst we've seen in this game, but it is a slight hitch, and it does affect the averages in a big way. In a second plot with 2 separate sets of data, but also with asynchronous compute support disabled, we see the same behavior repeat. Things are mostly equivalent up until one hard spike, and it's around the same spot in the same test path where we hit approximately 28 milliseconds for several consecutive frames. Now, if we do a frame time plot for asynchronous compute support enabled, you'll see basically the same thing. It seemed to be agnostic toward the setting, so enabling or disabling it in the XML file did not affect this performance. It was fully capable of performing well or not great in either instance. Finally, we have one set of data where we were able to produce a replicable, repeated result that seems to have verified some of the claims online. Specifically at 1440p high on the 5700 XT, we were able to repeatedly demonstrate that the average 0.1% low figure dropped with the default async compute option of off. We retested this multiple times, like all the others, and also added a second GPU to the rotation. The end result was about 8 sets of data for off and for on across the 2 cards, so roughly in the range of 60 to 80,000 individual frame time data points, where we found that 0.1% lows did actually improve. We couldn't replicate this in any of the other tests, but it seems to replicate consistently here. This may have something to do with which parts of the pipeline are getting hit harder at the 2 resolutions, or maybe just the game. We validated this multiple times on both cards, so it appears to be a real result, at least in this test, and async compute enablement did help in this specific set of settings. Just for some visualization, here's one final frame time plot. You can see that it's roughly the same performance behavior as we saw in the previous 1080p results, except it was repeatable and predictable with these settings. It almost seems like the asynchronous compute option wasn't applying at 1080p. And we did some things like write protect the file and making the changes in different orders, rebooting the system, things like that, making sure we applied all changes to the settings file without making any changes in game, all kinds of stuff to make sure that it wasn't overriding or overwriting the file when we launched the game to test. So we're not quite sure what to make of the difference between the 1080p and 1440p data with the 5700 XT, aside from pointing to a potential game bug. After all, there is a reason it's disabled by default, and it's probably because something was broken or not implemented. Otherwise, they would have just turned it on if it always makes things better. And just for clarity, most of the data today was done in Vulkan. There was a DX12 data point in here in the first half of the video for the CPU stuff, and we've done some Vulkan and DX12 comparisons in general. For our test bench, we didn't really see a difference in the lows that was meaningful between them. There's a bit of a difference, but it was outweighed on average by the higher average frame rate, more than you might typically see in games like Hitman 2, for example. And looking around and doing more testing on now, 4 different benches, which consists of probably maybe 6 motherboards of different types, because we did the CPU benchmarks as well, and each one of those is potentially a different board. We have a pretty good snapshot of performance, and this game does definitely have some weird quirks where it's You talk about people pointing at games and saying this is poorly optimized, but not quite knowing why. This is a fantastic example of a game that is genuinely poorly optimized, and we can point to reasons why. So those are pretty rare. But anyway, the end all for snapshot of performance, and this game does definitely have some weird quirks where it's you talk about people pointing at games and saying this is poorly optimized, but not quite knowing why. This is a fantastic example of a game that is genuinely poorly optimized, and we can point to reasons why. So those are pretty rare. But anyway, the end all for these two issues, for the 9700K, it's a specific issue. It was explained a few times in this video. Not going to go through it again, but it's resolvable via workaround if you intentionally lower your frame rate, either by cap or just by increasing the graphics quality to the extent that your GPU becomes a bottleneck and you reduce your frame rate at the same time below something like 140. And then for the asynchronous compute thing, up until the very end, the last set of tests we ran, we weren't able to validate the claims that turning it on or off even mattered at all for Vulkan, which was the primary claim, was that it helps with Vulkan and with AMD cards. But we couldn't validate it, period, with the two NVIDIA devices we tested and the two resolutions. And we couldn't validate it for the first half of our AMD tests. But in that final set of 1440 tests, it seemed to work. And for a lot of this stuff, there's not really a clear indication as to why there's this disparity of when it does versus doesn't work.